few days, the house was full of noise and people. Workmen came to build a stage in Sir Thomas's library, and servants ran here and there to obey Tom's orders. The actors rehearsed morning and evening, and Fanny helped Mrs. Norris with the sewing of the costumes. The worst moment for Fanny came when Edmund and Miss Crawford asked her to help them rehearse their love scene. At first, she felt flattered to be of help, but soon she saw the way they looked at each other as they spoke their words.
"It's only a play,"
she told herself.
"But oh, I don't think they're acting."
And that night, she cried herself to sleep in her small bedroom. The next evening, there was going to be a full rehearsal in costume in front of Lady Bertram, Mrs. Norris, the Grants, and Fanny. They were all waiting for the play to begin, when suddenly Julia ran into the room.
"Our father is here,"
she cried.
"He's in the hall at this moment."
The baronet had other worries. By now, he had discovered what a very stupid young man Mr. Rushworth was, and he wondered how Maria really felt about her fiancé.
"Maria,"
he said kindly to her,
"if you no longer wish to marry Mr. Rushworth, just tell me."
"Thank you, sir,"
replied Maria, after only a moment's thought.
"But I have the greatest respect for Mr. Rushworth, and every intention of marrying him."
Now that she had no hope of marrying Henry Crawford, she was determined to escape from Mansfield Park and her father's influence. Marrying Mr. Rushworth seemed to her now the best way of doing that. Her father accepted her answer as an honest one, and hoped that Mr. Rushworth would improve as he got older. 2 months later, Maria Bertram married Mr. Rushworth at Southerton Church. The young couple moved to Brighton, a town on the south coast, for several weeks. Julia was invited to join them, because Maria needed a more interesting companion than her husband. The two sisters, enemies when charming Mr. Crawford had been around, were close friends once more. On the way to the parsonage, Edmund looked kindly at Fanny and admired her dress.
"It's very pretty, Fanny. Hasn't Miss Crawford got one like it?"
For a moment, Fanny felt sad, but she was pleased at least that Edmund liked her dress. The evening went well for her. The Grants and their guests enjoyed talking, so she was able to look around her and listen. Henry Crawford had just arrived for another visit. He tried to talk to Fanny about the play, but she was determined not to have a conversation with him. She wanted to hear what Edmund was saying to Dr. Grant about the living he would soon take up.
"I'll be ordained in a few weeks,"
Edmund was saying. he told his family that he was giving a ball at Mansfield Park for Fanny and William. Fanny thought it was almost too great an honour.
My first ball,
She thought.
I'll dance with William and Edmund, I hope. But I'll have to talk to so many important people, and everyone will look at me. And what shall I wear?
But when the day of the ball arrived, Fanny really began to enjoy herself. She wore a new dress, and round her neck she wore a cross which William had given her, on a chain which Edmund had given her. Presents from the two people who were dearest in the world to her. Another chain which Mary Crawford had given Fanny to wear, an old present from Henry, lay upstairs in Fanny's room, still in its box. The ball went much better than she had expected. She had to dance with Henry Crawford, but he spoke politely and gently to her, and she realized how much his behavior had improved. Sir Thomas felt very proud of his niece, and he was sure that Mr. Crawford was in love with her.
It's just a question of time before he asks to marry her,
He thought. After the ball, Henry Crawford went to London on business. William returned to his ship, and Edmund went to stay with a friend, Mr. Owen, for a few days. Mary Crawford found she missed Edmund very much. When a week passed with no news of his return, she decided to ask Fanny about him.
Are you surprised that your cousin is staying so long at Mr. Owen's?
She said, as lightly as she could.
Not really,
replied Fanny.
But Mr. Owen has 3 daughters, I hear. I expect they are all very pretty. Perhaps they sing well and play the piano, the harp, or some other instrument. I know nothing of the Miss Owens,
replied Fanny calmly.
I shall have to leave Mansfield soon myself. I'm sorry I won't see your cousin again before I leave.
Fanny's honesty made her say, The next morning, Henry was at Mansfield Park again, much earlier than the usual visiting hour. Luckily for him, he found Fanny alone.
My dear Miss Price,
he said,
it is with great delight that I bring you this news. I have here a commission for your brother William. Would you like to see it?
Fanny could not speak, but took the papers with a shaking hand. While she read them, Crawford said,
This was my reason for going to London.
So you have done this?
cried Fanny.
How very, very kind. How did you manage it?
My uncle is an admiral, you know.
Sir Thomas asked Edmund to use his influence with Fanny to persuade her to accept.
Dear Fanny,
Edmund said to her later the next day.
I know you're worried about Crawford's proposal. I think it's a very honest one. But of course, you should refuse him if you really can't love him.
Oh, Edmund, I'm so happy to hear you say that. I thought you were against me, like your father.
No, Fanny. But think of this. Crawford really loves you and wants to make you happy. Let him succeed, Fanny.
Oh, never. He will never persuade me. We are so very different.
Well, I think it may sometimes be good to have a husband and wife who see things differently.
Fanny knew he was thinking of himself and Mary Crawford.
I must say, cousin,
She said,
that I don't like his character. I haven't thought well of him since the play. He made both Maria and Julia think he was in love with them.
Don't think of that time.
In a few days' time, Fanny and William were on their way. The journey took 2 days, and by the time they arrived at the Prices' small house in Portsmouth, they were both very tired. Fanny's mother welcomed her warmly, but her younger brothers and sisters did not remember her well. She was left in a dark corner of the sitting room, while the boys ran around shouting and the girls argued among themselves. Mrs. Price and her servant were busy packing the clothes that William was taking back to his ship. Mr. Price spoke a few words to Fanny, but soon returned to reading his newspaper. Fanny felt disappointed and miserable. No one seemed interested in her. What a home it was! An untidy little house in a back street, full of noisy, quarrelling children, with a dirty-looking servant who did not obey orders. Her mother could not control her large family and looked tired. Seven weeks after her arrival in Portsmouth, a letter from Edmund arrived.
Mansfield Park. My dear Fanny, I am back at home now, less hopeful of marriage than before. Has Miss Crawford told you of her feelings for me? Don't worry, I won't ask you to tell me. But I like the idea that she and I both have you as a friend, that we both love you. I spent 3 weeks in London and saw her often. I'm afraid her fashionable friends have a bad influence on her. They've persuaded her that a woman needs to marry for money and a high social position. But I can't give her up, Fanny. She's the only woman in the world whom I could ever think of as my wife.
Fanny was disgusted by this letter. It showed the true characters of both Henry and Mary Crawford in the clearest possible light. Mary had a cold-hearted interest in money and social position. She was suddenly eager to marry Edmund if he became a baronet and had a large fortune.
Bribing a doctor?
Thought Fanny in horror.
How can she joke about that kind of thing and talk so lightly of Tom's death?
And Henry was continuing his bad behaviour with Maria, now a married woman. Far from feeling jealous, Fanny was disappointed in him. She had thought his character was improving. There was no difficulty about her reply. She wrote a few short lines describing honestly the seriousness of Tom's illness and politely refusing Miss Crawford's offer to take her back to Mansfield. She knew she must wait for her